Hey everyone, and welcome to the lecture video on Buddhism, or more generally, Panentheism, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. First, my obligatory remark that you should be doing the readings as well as watching these videos to do well on the assessments. Remember that there are some questions that will be in the readings that are not in these lectures, that do appear on the assessments. So that being said, we're kind of in the section now where we're talking about God. And many of us in the Western world, where Christianity or Islam is the dominant worldview or dominant religion, are familiar with thinking of God in what's called a monotheistic way. So the idea that God is separated from the universe. God kind of starts the universe, and the universe is a separate being, although God may interact with it. In this section, as you've already seen with Stoicism, and earlier with Taoism, we're looking at a different understanding of God, of seeing God or the higher power in the universe, if there is one, more as a force, more as a part of the universe around us. And indeed, that's sort of what the Stoics believed. They said there's this thing called logos that's always unfolding that we're a part of. So we're sort of all part of God, including this remote, this shirt, everything, according to pantheism. That's how the Taoists saw things as well. Buddhism's a little bit different, and as you can see from this slide that kind of distinguishes the different ways we can think about God or the divine force or energy in the universe, Buddhists believe in what's called Panentheism. And that's the view, not that God is in everything. So Buddhists don't think that this is God, or the shirt is God, or the camera I'm staring at is God. But they believe that all living beings have a divine light within them. So in other words, Panentheism is the view that God is within us. If God started out as sort of a pool of water, we are all different pieces of that pool. We are all droplets of that pool. So we all have sort of a divine agency or being within us. And that is what Buddhists call Buddha nature. They basically say, as we'll talk about, the Buddha was the first one to discover this, according to Buddhists, to discover that he had what is now known as Buddha nature within him, or sort of a divine light or force there that needs to be awakened. And he then led that knowledge to the rest of humanity, so that we now know we all have Buddha nature, or sometimes Buddha nature is called the capacity to become a Buddha, the capacity to become awakened or enlightened. And I'll talk about what all those words mean throughout the course of this lecture, but I just wanted to distinguish those different ways of thinking about or defining God, because we often, especially in our culture, we just use the term God. And by the way, everybody does it, not just religious folks. Atheists just throw out the term God, and they often mean a monotheistic God without sort of distinguishing among the different ways that we could think about God. Now, you'll notice at the beginning of this PowerPoint that there's a free write sort of asking you about, that typical phrase you hear, spiritual but not religious. And I'm not going to go over that, but I encourage you to think about that for yourself, because many people who may not be a fan of religion, you still find yourself spiritual. And a lot of the ideas we'll talk about today are often today considered spiritual. So I list some people like Alan Watts or Eckhart Tolle, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, who represent a lot of the ideas I'm going to talk about today, but in a more modern form. I also have an image of a guy named Ramana Maharshi, who I include because he's lesser known, and I think he should be more known. A lot of people consider him to be sort of the most recent modern example of somebody like a Buddha. For one thing, he had no material possessions. He lived in one area his whole life, as you can see in that PowerPoint, called Aranchala. He lived by this now famous mountain that people today continue to visit. He was also supposedly just had sort of an aura or an energy about him that people would just go to meditate near him, and kind of his wisdom or his enlightenment would rub off on them. I'm just reporting what I've heard and read about this guy. But he's certainly an example, a modern day example of what we're talking about with the Buddha from the past. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check Ramana Maharshi out. So the major ideas we'll be looking at are some of the core beliefs from Buddhism. And let me be clear that this is not This is not a world religions class. I encourage you to take one, very important class. But in this class, we're not going to focus on the differences in types of Buddhism, such as Mahayana versus Theravada versus Tibetan. I'm just going to focus on the philosophy, because after all, it is a philosophy class. And there are core beliefs that unite all Buddhists, just as there are core beliefs that unite all Christians or Muslims and so forth. So we're of course going to look at those core beliefs. So the Four Noble Truths are kind of the principle, the foundation of Buddhism. You'll notice that in one of the questions I asked on the previous PowerPoint, it was about suffering. What do you think about suffering? And for the Buddha, and as we'll see also in Christian theology, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, suffering's a huge problem, right? Because we can ask the question of, first of all, from a Buddhist perspective, why does life seem to be just sort of suffering? And the Buddha's first noble truth was that life is suffering. Except, as we'll talk about, a better translation of the word they use, which is dukkha, is lack of satisfaction or unsatisfactoriness. So the Buddhists argue that our lives are just sort of filled with this sense of loss or lack from the moment we're born, and they'll tell us what the problem is there and how to alleviate that. But from a Christian perspective, as I'm sure many of you know, there's the question of, if God is an all-powerful being, why does he allow his children, us, to suffer? And that's known as the problem of evil, which we'll talk about in depth in the next lecture. The metaphysics of Buddhism, as you can see in these major ideas, we're going to talk about how everything's connected. That's a fairly straightforward idea I'm sure many of you have heard of. I already just mentioned Buddha nature. One of the more difficult ideas to discuss is no self, because the Buddha, as we'll talk about, they don't literally mean there isn't a self or we don't exist. They're just saying that the way we think about the self is incorrect. There's an error in sort of our thinking, in the way we believe what we believe ourselves to be. And in fact, they believe that error is what's causing a lot of the suffering and that sense of lack in our lives. Namely, we tend to think that our self is some permanent entity, but we, being part of the physical world as well, we are going to deteriorate and die too. And that's one of the reasons we suffer, is that we want to hold on to life when it's actually not permanent. That's part of it. So we'll talk about that. And then I'm sure many of you have heard of karma and reincarnation, karma in particular. Now, the difference though is a lot of people in the Western world, in our world, tend to think of reincarnation as something good. Like you're like, oh, I was a prince in my last life, and I hope I can become this in my next life. And in Buddhism, as we'll see, you do not want to reincarnate. In fact, the whole goal of the system is to pull yourself out of the cycle of reincarnation. So the idea within Buddhism, they have this thing called samsara, or the cycle of life. We go through different existences, different lives, building up karma, good and bad karma, which follows us from one life to the next. But the idea is to become good or become awakened. And when you do that, you pull yourself out of the cycle. So the cycle of life is not a good thing for Buddhists. If you're reincarnating, it means you haven't fully learned the principles of Buddhism. Because reincarnating means you're getting another chance to do it again. Right? And as we'll see, Buddhists do believe that you can reincarnate into lower realms that are not the human realm. They even have a concept of hell, as we'll see. But I just want to correct that misunderstanding that often comes up in Buddhism. Reincarnation is, you're supposed to stop reincarnating. That's the goal of Buddhism. So let's talk about Siddartha Gautama, who was the man who would become the Buddha. Gautama was born into what is now Nepal, kind of a little chunk of land sandwiched in between China and India. And he was a prince. And he basically, as any prince, most princes do, he had everything he wanted or needed in terms of material possessions, material goods. He had all the food he wanted. He had all the opportunities to train in archery and wrestling and different princely duties. He was treated well. He could have any woman that he wanted and so forth. As again, all the princely things that you can imagine, he had them. And yet, he wasn't happy. he had all these great things, and there was still something in the background that just didn't sit well with him. And he didn't know why, because he said, everyone around me is telling me I'm going to become the king one time at some point, and I have this great life, and yet I don't feel fulfilled. So that feeling, he would later realize, was dukkha, or the suffering, the first noble truth that I mentioned before, that I'll also talk about later. But he notices this at this time and just doesn't know what to do about it. And he also notices that the people around him are not, including his parents, are not really happy either, despite having all these great things. And eventually he wanders from his kingdom briefly, and he was sheltered too. His parents would not let him outside. They wanted to keep him away from what they saw to be corruption of the outside world. And one day the Buddha sneaks away, Siddartha Gautama at this time, and he sees physical suffering. So recall that he had experienced kind of that mental suffering, but now he sees physical suffering. So for example, he sees beggars and children who are emaciated. You can see their bones through their skin and so forth. And the Buddha realizes that, man, this whole suffering thing is pretty bad. This whole dukkha thing is pretty bad. Not only do we suffer physically, but even if you have all your physical needs met, so even if those kids who were emaciated got the food they needed and became healthy physically, they would still suffer mentally, right? So life seems to be pointless, said the Buddha, in this sense, because what's the point of living if all we do is suffer? If we work and work and work to get the house and the white picket fence and have the kids, and yet we still feel a sense of lack. We still don't feel true fulfillment. And that's the problem of life that the Buddha identifies. And eventually he decides, this is too big of a problem. I don't want to become the king. I don't want to just achieve more material possessions. I need to go figure out what's wrong. So he decides to go on what's a spiritual journey, to leave his kingdom and to cut ties with his family. And so you can see there's a relief there on the left in the PowerPoint, and the Buddha is standing in the middle, kind of doing this motion. What that symbolizes is that he had a long ponytail, which in that kingdom symbolized wealth and royalty, symbolized that he was a prince. So he's cutting off his ponytail. That symbolizes that he's going on his journey, and he's saying, I'm cutting ties completely with my connections to this kingship. I'm completely shrugging that off, throwing that off. And he actually goes off and just kind of is going to wander into the mountains and find wise men and women to teach him. And maybe he can learn what is the point of living if it's just dukkha, if it's just the suffering, mental and physical. And so he cuts off the ponytail and he leaves, and the stories differ here. He has a begging bowl with him, just enough to beg for food so that he can survive. He has rags. He completely pushes away all the riches of his kingdom. And he goes off for many years. And the stories differ here a lot depending on the Buddhist you ask, so I don't claim to have the perfect interpretation. I'm just going off several legitimate sources that I have read. And so he goes off, and he meets many wise people, and he learns how to control his mind better. He learns meditative techniques. We'll talk a little bit about meditation later. But one of the people that he meets is what's known today as an ascetic monk. And these people have existed for thousands of years. They existed for thousands of years even when the Buddha was alive. So the idea of an ascetic monk is somebody who completely shrugs off all their physical sensual desires. No sex, no thoughts about sex, no indulgence in any sort of, you would never have a tasty meal of any kind, not even a vegetarian one. You're just eating what you need to survive, just some water and some rice a day. And ascetic monks basically will sit for hours, sometimes all day, and meditate in just the lotus position, just sort of finding serenity and peace in their surroundings and in life. And the idea is that the reason why you don't have that peace is because you're always pursuing sensual things. You always want something. Now, the Buddha would later disagree with the ascetic perspective. Although he partly agrees, he agrees that material things don't bring happiness. He does think that there needs to be a middle path, he'll talk about later. So he doesn't agree with the Buddha, with the ascetic monks, that we have to restrict everything in order to find peace. But we'll get there. But anyways, you can see in that picture on the left, there's actually an ascetic monk that's from the 1950s when Britain was occupying India. And this monk is actually committing suicide. That's a real picture of a monk committing suicide in that moment. And just to show you how powerful that practice can be, he's in the lotus position, not moving while his body is burning to death. Right? Can you imagine the incredible pain that most people would be in? For him, he's just sitting there in defiance of the British government. So that's the extent to which people sometimes seem to be able to control their bodies and appetites and so forth. He's controlling his ability to feel pain, right? He's developed that sense of mastery over his body. There's another modern guy who's known as the Iceman, who has done stuff like this, like sitting in, literally, as you can see in the picture, sitting in snow-filled mountains, but also he sat in vats of ice and so forth, and he also seems to have the ability to have some control over his body temperature and so forth. So anyways, the Buddha meets these people. He learns good techniques for controlling his mind and his body, but he still hasn't answered the important question about life, which is, what's the point of living if it's all dukkha, if it's all mental and physical suffering? Eventually, though, and the stories differ a lot here, he goes on for many more years, he meets more people, he learns more techniques, but eventually he gets so frustrated that he's not actually finding the deep answer to the question that he wants from anybody. And he kind of just says, that's it, I'm going to sit down under this tree. He finds a tree in the forest, and he said, I'm going to sit down under this tree until I'm answered or I'm dead. And he sits down, and supposedly, again, the stories differ. He bathed in the stream first, a woman brought him some rice milk, but eventually he sits down and he just sits there and reflects and concentrates until it finally comes to him. He has a moment of what we now call enlightenment. He wakes up, he sees reality as it actually is, and he sees the cause of our suffering, and he sees what to do about it. And all those things that he sees in that awakening experience would become what we know as Buddhism today. And so all the principles of Buddhism come from what the Buddha saw when he became enlightened. And for the rest of his life, he didn't want to be, but he became a teacher because people followed him, and they could perceive that he had achieved something that they hadn't. And he eventually, later in his life, also supposedly reunited with his parents. And famously, he, on his deathbed, some of his students who had been following him around were crying and sad that he was dying. And the Buddha said, why are you crying over me? I'm just a physical being. I'm impermanent just like you. We will all die someday. This is part of the message I've been teaching you. So he sort of chastises them for feeling bad about him dying, because he says that's the message, is that death isn't a bad thing. It's the way we perceive death that's the problem. So anyways, the Buddha does that, becomes enlightened. Now, before we move on, though, we need to reflect on what is enlightenment? What does it mean to wake up? Not an easy question to answer, right? Just like a parallel in Christianity, it's not an easy question to answer as to what is God's will, right? It's easy to say, well, that's God's will, but how does it work, right? What are the logistics? With enlightenment, it's also difficult to put into words, but we're going to try. So, as you can see there on that slide, one way to get at enlightenment is to think about what I would call a moment of higher awareness, a moment when you sometimes people describe it as you lost a sense of yourself. A lot of times these experiences happen in nature. Sometimes they, of course, happen on drugs, not going to deny that. But what unites these experiences is that there's something special about them that goes beyond yourself, right? You somehow expand beyond the typical concept of self. And the reason I have that picture there of the Mayan ruins is that I had an experience like this, that's Tikal in Guatemala. One of the best Mayan ruins, by the way, out there, still well preserved, huge, tall, towering city for that time. And when I was there, the experience I had was I was with a friend, and you could climb up to the top of these pyramids, to many of the pyramids. And we had climbed up to the top of one, and we were kind of sitting there, and it was hot, but we were resting. We had walked around a lot. We had been hiking, so I sort of already felt a sense of peace just sitting down in my body. And my friend says, I'm going to go down and go to the bathroom. I'll meet you down there. And I said, okay, I'm going to stay up and kind of relax for another 10 minutes. And I stay up at the top, and there's nobody else up there. And and I can't see other people who are down below. So it kind of seems like it's just me alone in this ancient Mayan city, and it's really cool. And I can see that pyramid in the distance that you see on that slide. And anyways, I had a moment where not just a moment, it was several minutes where I sort of lost my sense of self. I became one with everything around me. And of course, when I say things like that, it sounds like bullshit, right? That's when people come in and say, dude, what are you talking about? And this is the problem with enlightenment experiences, is that they're very powerful for individuals, but it's hard to generalize them to other people. And in fact, if we generalize too strongly, that would be an example of the anecdotal evidence fallacy, right? That we're using our own experience to justify something for everyone. Nonetheless, lots of people have had these experiences, and there seems to be something incredible about them. And so, how does this connect to enlightenment? Well, it connects to enlightenment because it seems like that is a taste of what it would like to be enlightened, what it would be like to be enlightened. So it's kind of like you, in those moments of higher awareness, you raise yourself up to a higher understanding, but then when it ends, you come back down. And if you're an enlightened being, you would always be up at that higher level of understanding. You would always be up higher, and you sort of walk around in that state, so to speak. So an enlightened being is somebody who always realizes that connection to a higher divinity. Now, of course, what the Buddhists call that is Buddha nature, right? They've discovered the divine light within them to become enlightened. So anyways, that we're not going to get a perfect definition of enlightenment, but I think we can get a sense of what it might be like thinking about those experiences. Okay, so let's look in a little more depth at the Four Noble Truths. As mentioned before, the first noble truth is the one that the Buddha saw is suffering, right? That's the beginning of everything. That's what pushed him on his journey, is why live this life if it's just about suffering, if it's just about this thing called dukkha. And again, I want to hone in on dukkha, that it is more than just physical suffering. It is not just a broken leg or cancer. It's that mental sense of lack. And in fact, like I said before, it's often better defined as unsatisfactoriness. Life has a lack of satisfaction to it, according to Buddhists. And I think we've all experienced this on some level. I mean, think about how we cover up our negative feelings by going out and hanging out with friends, or playing a video game, or watching a Netflix show, or just going out drinking, doing drugs. We cover up that sense of lack. But at the same time, after that night of drinking, what happens when you wake up in the morning? It all comes crashing back, right? Reality comes in, and you feel that loss, you feel that sense of deprivation. That's the dukkha for the Buddhists. That is the lack of satisfaction, that loss, that feeling of lack that is always in the background. It's kind of like, metaphorically, it's kind of like if you've ever been in a room and there was a heater going on in the background, kind of the hum of a heater, or air conditioning, whatever it is. And then that air conditioning or heater turns off, and you notice it, and you say, oh wow, I didn't realize it was there. That's like the dukkha. The dukkha is that subtle. It's always sort of there, burning in the background, keeping us down, giving us this sense of lack, and sometimes we pay attention to it, sometimes we don't. But the Buddha would argue, in order to be happy, in order to find that feeling of fulfillment, finding true fulfillment, you've got to address the dukkha. You can't just keep covering it up. And in fact, that's why lack of material things is strongly emphasized in Buddhism, because people tend to cover up this sense of lack with stuff, right? More stuff, bigger house, better job, and so forth. And anyways, that's the beginning point. So, by the way, if you disagree, and some people disagree, they say, I don't think life has that feature to it. If you disagree, then kind of the rest of Buddhism falls away. It's kind of like in Christianity, if you don't accept Jesus as the savior, kind of the rest of the religion doesn't make much sense after that. So in Buddhism, that's kind of the core belief is, well, life is suffering. Now, the second noble truth is that we suffer because we are self-centered beings. We are attached to things. And that's what I was just describing. We get attached to stuff. But the worst thing we're attached to, and this is a little bit lesser known in the West, according to Buddhists, is the idea of a permanent self that will always be there. Whether that's because we think our self will continue on into heaven, or whether we, even if we don't believe in heaven, we might have a sense that our physical self will always be here, and we don't really appreciate that we're going to die someday. And that's why I have the pictures below of kind of the guy getting old, because even if you're perfectly physically capable and you have no disease of any kind, you're still going to die, and that sucks. Right? So the Buddhist says that that's part of the suffering we experience, is that, again, even when everything's going well physically, just like he was as a prince, there's always that kind of suffering in the background. So we suffer because of this attachment to self. Now, the third noble truth just reminds us, hey, it's fixable, man. We can get around this. We can overcome this attachment. And the way they do that is they recommend what's called the Eightfold Path. Now, I'm not going to ask you guys to remember the Eightfold Path in depth, but I will just point out that it's all these things that I call the rights. Right? So it's like right living, right thinking, right meditation, and so forth, right ethics. And by right, they mean consistent with Buddhist metaphysics. They mean that you're appreciating interconnectedness and no self, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that's the way around it, is to follow that path. Now, in particular, meditation is highlighted, and I'll talk about why that's important soon. Actually, I'll talk about it now. That's coming up next. So meditation, first of all, we hear a lot of this term mindfulness in our society today, and indeed, they wouldn't have called it that in the past, but the Buddha would have done mindfulness meditation to some degree, which is basically just being aware, just stepping back and becoming aware, being mindful of your experience coming in without judging it. Now, that's crucial because I'm sure you've all had the experience of lying awake in bed at night and just having terrible thoughts go through your head, like if you're worried about an interview or you're worried about a fight you had with a friend. Notice how we're constantly judging those thoughts. We're judging ourselves, like, why did I do that? Why did I say this? And so forth. In those moments, sometimes they call that the monkey mind, right? The mind just keeps cycling thoughts and it makes us miserable. So mindfulness allows us to just watch those thoughts kind of pass through us like a vessel without attaching to them. And that's the first path towards enlightenment for the Buddha, is to sort of recognize that your thoughts are kind of part of this false self. There's this false cycle afflicting you, according to Buddhism. Now, the reason why I have this slide here about compassion is that sometimes you hear criticisms of Buddhists and say, oh, well, you're just telling us to fix our world problems. We have to meditate. Isn't that kind of selfish? But it's actually the opposite. So Buddhists are arguing that we have to help ourselves first before we help other people. We've got to get our own ducks in a row in our head and make sure our mind is clear before we go around trying to help others. Because if we're ignorant and we help, we might not actually help, right? If I'm an ignorant person and I go out and try to help other people, I'm going to help through the lens of ignorance. Also, Buddhists argue that we should actually meditate on compassion and become more compassionate through our meditations towards other beings. One meditation in particular that achieves this is called loving kindness meditation. And the idea is that you develop compassion through a process of kind of reflecting on people in your life. So for instance, you go from reflecting on somebody you really love, and this is all during a sort of meditation. You'd be sitting on a chair or in the lotus position, your eyes would be closed, you'd be in a quiet place usually, and you'd be reflecting. And so you first reflect on somebody you really love, like a significant other, mother, father, whoever, friend, and you kind of reflect on your feelings and your whole sense of relationship with that person. Then you reflect on somebody who's maybe a good friend, but you wouldn't describe as loving them. And you reflect on your feelings towards them. Then you move towards a decent friend, not one of your best friends maybe. Then you reflect on an acquaintance. This is where it gets hard, right? Now you reflect on somebody you don't really care about, you're just neutral. And then you start reflecting on somebody you don't like, to somebody you really don't like, to somebody you hate, And the idea is that over time you're supposed to develop that same sense of love towards all beings. Because an enlightened being, and this is one of the things the Buddha saw, an enlightened being is compassionate towards all. Right? An enlightened being is not resentful, is not angry. An enlightened being is above those base emotions. So an enlightened being will be one who has, as you can see in this slide, gotten to the point where you matter more than I matter. In other words, other beings matter more than my being. And in fact, you'll see in the reading, there's a type of enlightened being called a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is somebody who, like the Buddha, reaches enlightenment, but rather than kind of going into a sort of heaven-like realm of enlightenment and just sitting there and taking themselves out of the cycle of life, that bodhisattva stays back in the material world to help others become enlightened, because he has so much compassion for the beings in the universe he's a part of. So when somebody gets mad at an enlightened being or is rude to them, an enlightened being doesn't say, oh God, what a rude, doesn't get defensive. An enlightened being understands that rudeness comes from a deeper place and is compassionate towards them. Where does that rudeness come from? A sense of lack, a sense of loss. So an enlightened being has compassion for all beings, including somebody like Hitler, right? And that's the hardest part for some people to grasp. An enlightened being has love for all. And part of the way that is developed, according to Buddhism, is through meditation practice. Now, it's interesting because modern science has, as I'm sure many of you are aware, modern science has studied meditation in depth in the last 20, 30 years, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. And we've seen that there are a lot of benefits to meditation. I cited a couple studies there, you can see on the slide, of brief meditation. And this one is interesting because I believe in this study, the people who were chosen were very skeptical. They said, oh, what's this meditation crap? This isn't going to help anything. What's it going to do for me to just sit here and be silent? Nevertheless, they were asked to, I want to say, correct me if I'm wrong in this study if you look it up, but I think it's something like they sat for like 3 times a week, maybe for 15, 20 minutes and meditated. And they actually reported changes that were measurable through scientific devices. So they found that their brain function improved, working memory, they reduced fatigue and anxiety. And I want to say this was only over a couple months, maybe 2-3 month period. Right? So that's evidence that brief periods of meditation can have an impact. And then there's a longer study that showed significant changes in the brain that were also observed physiologically and in the people's reports. So in other words, they saw that their brain physically changed, as well as the people reported feeling those changes. Now, the other reason why people are studying meditation is we've discovered something called neuroplasticity, brain plasticity, the fact that the brain is malleable, that our neurons can shift around. We didn't know this before, and the way scientists discovered it was there were people who got in car accidents or some kind of accidents, and they hurt, part of their brain was damaged, and they lost something like the loss of their hand or their finger. And the doctors told them at first, well, we're sorry, you've lost the use of your hand, it's never coming back. 6 months, a year later, they came back into the hospital and said, hey doc, look, my hand is working. And what they discovered was that a part of the brain that had been used for a different function took over the damaged tissue from the hand. And basically, a part of the brain that was being used for something else also did that other thing still, but then part of the neurons came over to take over the other part that had been damaged. In other words, the brain fixed itself, so to speak. Now, what's interesting about that is it shows that our brains, like the name implies, are plastic and malleable. And what they've discovered is that And what is supported by these studies is that can be done ourselves, right? By meditating, we are literally changing our brains. Now, to be fair, this doesn't prove Buddhism right or true. It just shows that the practice of meditation has these benefits. And of course, a Buddhist would say, well, these benefits are all nice, but the real benefit for a Buddhist is Buddha nature. Right? It's not about getting a little better working memory or reducing your stress, because it's about deep fulfillment and finding your true nature, who you are deep inside, which for them, for a Buddhist, is Buddha nature. So I already kind of mentioned the dukkha, so I'm going to skip over that free ride. Let's talk about interconnectedness and impermanence for a minute. So again, this one's fairly straightforward. Buddhists believe that everything is moving and changing and linked together. Just like that image there shows of kind of the world with the web, right? It's kind of like there's a web of stuff all around us that's always being influenced and interacting with everything else. And that's the essence of interconnectedness / impermanence. And it's important to note that those two things go together, right? Everything's impermanent, so it's always it could all die, and the plant, when it dies, becomes part of the soil, just like we do. But it's also interconnected, so even while it's alive, it's still interconnected and moving, and nothing is set in stone, according to the Buddhists. And there's some support for this in the idea that every 7 or 8 years or so, our cells completely regenerate, and so the cells on your arm right now are different than the ones you had before. Definitely our bodies change and grow. Think about the difference between how you were when you were 5 years old and how you are now, and how the great changes that your body undergoes throughout the aging process. So all of this suggests that we are all connected, changing beings. And it's sort of difficult for us to appreciate this because it's so easy to see ourselves as separate. Right? I seem like a professor, different from you. You seem like a student, different from me. Even if I'm just at a park watching a kid run around on the playground, that kid seems like an independent entity, like an independent thing. On the other hand, he couldn't exist without the air and the environment, right? He couldn't exist without his mother's love when he was younger, just like I couldn't have. He couldn't exist without all these other factors, without food. He couldn't exist if his heart wasn't pumping blood properly. So there's a number of factors that depend on his existence, however separate he seems. And going back to the dukkha, one of the reasons, again, we suffer is because we tend to see the world as permanent, discrete things. That tree, that camera, this remote, this professor, rather than seeing ourselves as part of a greater whole, as part of a machine, if you will, of nature, of the universe. Now, there's a criticism here of Buddhism that comes in, and some people say, okay, Mr. Buddhist, so you're telling me that we're all interconnected, are you? And that we're all impermanent. Well, then why don't you just jump out of a plane and kill yourself and just merge with the universe? Because after all, we're all one, so why does it matter if you're this physical body or if you're splat on the ground and connected to the earth again now? The response Buddhists have to that, and you'll see this in the reader, is called the twofold truth. So the twofold truth reminds us that at the deepest level of reality, the level of interconnectedness and impermanence, the true level of reality, everything's connected and impermanent. It reminds us that this is the true nature. This is what the Buddha saw during his meditation, that everything is connected that way. But, as you'll see, there's a second level to reality. And the Buddhists call this the superficial level of reality, meaning superficial as in the sense, this is the level at which we apply labels. So it's practical for me to call this a remote. Yes, is it truly kind of this interconnected thing, just some cells that will fall away someday and decay? Yes, just like me, that's true. But in order to get by in the world, we have to think of this as the remote. And you have to think of me as Professor Cuddy. And I have to think of that as the camera. Even though deep down it's all connected and I'm not really Professor Cuddy, I'm just part of the universe, it's practical to give labels so we can get by in the world. So in other words, when someone says, oh, Mr. Buddhist, just jump in front of the train and merge with the universe, the Buddha says, no, it's not a practical thing to do. Right? They say, the Buddhist will say, I acknowledge that there is a practicality to life, that there is a level of life that is superficial. So a Buddhist isn't swayed by that objection. A Buddhist goes through his life doing practical things. A Buddhist could work at McDonald's, right? A Buddhist could go through life doing normal things. It's just the difference is that a Buddhist always has a deep appreciation of impermanence in the back of his mind. So even if let's just take the McDonald's example, even if he's working at McDonald's to make money, if he loses that job or something bad happens at work, he always reminds himself, oh, well, it's impermanent though, right? It's all kind of just part of this greater whole. And he doesn't get attached, right? He's not gonna get in a fight with his coworker over how to make the Big Mac if he's a Buddhist, if he's working at McDonald's. So that's impermanence. Now let's tie this in to no self. So like I said, no self is somewhat of a difficult concept to understand. I've been kind of hammering it away throughout the course of this lecture, so I hope you have some idea. But I want to emphasize that the Buddhist is not saying literally there's no self. We translate the word from Sanskrit that way, which is anatta. We translate it as no self. But what it really means is false self, falsely perceived self. So Buddhists acknowledge that we have something we call a self. It's the same thing as the issue of impermanence. It's just that we give a label to it, and instead of just appreciating that as a label, we take it to be permanent, right? So instead of just saying, well, you're calling me Professor Cuddy because it's practical, we're thinking, well, Professor Cuddy, I will exist forever on some level. And that's where the error comes in. That's where the suffering comes in, because instead of understanding that I'm impermanent, including my very self, I think it's permanent. And I think it will always be present. It will always be there. So as you can see on that slide, our cells are regenerating. For a Buddhist, especially when we meditate and we look inward, we don't see any center or core. And again, I encourage you to test the Buddhist hypothesis here in your own meditation. What happens when you just sit in silence for 1 or 2 minutes? Most of us have the experience of the monkey mind, which is just thought after thought after emotion after emotion. Where is the self, right? Where is the permanent thing there? Where is the core? The Buddha says it's not there. Once we search and we look inward, there's no center to it. And we find that it's just a label we've given to this collection of cells that we're calling our bodies, this collection of matter we're calling our bodies. And the self is pernicious because we've been developing ourselves since we were young. This is very instructive to remember that infants don't really have a sense of self yet. A sense of self develops over time. In fact, there's some evidence that infants can't tell the difference between their hand and the environment around them. Right? Infants just seem to exist. And it's only over time that we start saying, oh, look at little Jimmy, he's such a good swimmer, or whatever. And then Jimmy becomes a swimmer when he's older, and he labels himself as a swimmer, and he starts to believe that swimming is a permanent characteristic of who he is. But it's really just a label that has applied and has built up over time. So our self is constantly being developed by society, by what others tell us, by our own conceptions of who we are. Say, oh, you're a really smart kid, right? You're a really smart kid. Yeah, I'm a smart kid, right? And now you start to think, I'm smart, as though that is always going to be the case. So society develops, our genetics develop our self, but for a Buddhist, it's all false. It's false in the sense that it's not permanent. We have an incorrect relationship to those things in their view. And it's so pernicious that even when you meditate and you have a moment of no self, or you have a moment where the monkey mind goes away, the instant you stop, it comes pouring right back in. Right? The false self comes right back in. You might have a great experience in the woods, one of those moments of higher awareness, and then you come back to your job at Target and you get angry at a customer. Right? Your false self has come back. Your false self has come back into the equation, has come back into the picture. And metaphorically, you can see how pernicious that square is in the lower right figure on the PowerPoint. That's not a square though, right? There's no square there. And yet, no matter how many times we look back and convince ourselves that it's just the placement of the little Pac-Man figures in the right place, the square just keeps coming back to our mind. So that's how harsh the self is. That's how pernicious the self is. It just keeps, our whole universe, our whole world, everybody around us is making us believe that we have a permanent self. So it's an uphill battle to remind our being that there is no permanent self. That's why meditation is so important in Buddhism. And let me just give you an example of of how to see this in practice during meditation. So if you're meditating, and again, you can pause this video and do this right now. Just take 1 or 2 minutes and try to be silent in your own mind. Just sit in silence and try not to think. See what happens. What's most likely going to happen is, first, you're probably going to think about not thinking. You're going to say, oh, I'm not thinking. But you're still going to be thinking. But if you do get to the point where your thoughts really cease and there's a little moment of peace there, that is your Buddha nature, which I'll talk about soon. That is the who you really are. That is what should shine forth over your false self. Your false self is the monkey mind. Your false self is all those stupid thoughts about, this is what I should have said. Oh, I'm so scared about the test in the future. Oh, I want to get this job. That's your false self. And the idea is that as you meditate more and more, those moments of peace between all the BS thoughts, those moments of peace expand. So that when you're meditating, you're just in peace now, instead of having all these thoughts shoot around. By the way, don't make the mistake of saying, oh, my mind is so much worse than everyone else's. My mind, I can't stop my mind at all. That's true for everyone. It's not just you, right? Sometimes people say that as a barrier to meditation, like, oh, my mind's different. Your mind is not different. Everybody has the experience of a monkey mind. Everybody has the experience of a mind that is hard to control, that gets away from them. So you're not unique in that way. You might be unique in a lot of other ways, but it's very clear that all humans share that trait of the monkey mind. So you can see on the next slide that the main reason we suffer, and I'm kind of moving to the second noble truth now, is because we fail to appreciate that there is a false self. That's the main reason. We do suffer too because we get attached to objects and ideas. And by the way, you can be attached to the idea of enlightenment and not be enlightened. You could be attached to the very idea of, oh, I'm going to become enlightened. I want to be enlightened. I am enlightened. And you wouldn't be enlightened. You'd just be attached to the idea of it. But mostly, Buddhists argue, we're attached to the false self. And that's what prevents us from seeing that Buddha nature, that truth of that divine light or force within us. So what we really are deep down is that Buddha nature, not that false self. Now let me just hone in on the Buddha nature for a moment. And I think this image here really helps. So Buddhists argue that everybody, all beings, have the capacity to be a Buddha. Nobody is excluded from that. Nobody is excluded. Everybody can become a Buddha. And in that image, you can see that this guy is ripping open his chest to show that there's a Buddha within. That symbolizes the Buddha nature within us that we all have, and that most of us never realize for our entire life. And so the idea, again, to bring forth that Buddha nature is to meditate and to follow that Eightfold Path, to be compassionate, so that you rise above the ego, that you rise above the false self. And actually there's a story I like from, I believe it's from the Lotus Sutra, which is, by the way, the sutras are sort of the holy books of Buddhism. There's a number of different ones. And the Lotus Sutra is one. And there's a story of a woman who lives in a poor community, and she doesn't have enough to pay, I think, a local lord or something for her, some sort of taxes or fees. And she's worried, and she's going to get kicked off her land. And she has this dress that was given to her by, I think, a relative or something, and she's had it her whole life. And she's poor, so she doesn't have a lot of clothes, so she wears that dress all the time. And she finds out that sewn into that dress was this ruby or jewel that was worth an incredible amount of money. So she found out that actually her whole life she'd been rich. She just didn't realize that she had it within her. And that's a metaphor for Buddha nature, is that we're all rich. We all have Buddha nature. We all have a jewel sewn into our clothes, so to speak, except that jewel is our Buddha nature and it's sewn into our being. We just have to awaken it, right? So everybody is walking around as an unawakened Buddha. That's how Buddhists see things, and they just need the right path or guidance to pull open their chest, so to speak, to release that Buddha nature and to reach that true fulfillment in their life. And so also notice that, just to connect it back to the concepts of God I talked about at the beginning, notice that this is panentheistic, meaning that God is within us. The divine force or light comes from within. It's not, unlike a Taoist or a Stoic, it's not part of this remote. It's not part of the camera. It's within us. It's within conscious beings. Okay, so let's wrap all this up, this discussion of Buddhism, with karma and reincarnation. How does that factor into this whole no-self stuff? How does that factor into the whole metaphysics, to all the metaphysics of Buddhism? Well, as we live our lives, we are building up good and bad karma. Every time we do good actions, like helping someone across the street, or letting someone in our house when they're in need, and so forth, we're building up good karma. Every time we do something bad, like lie, cheat, or steal, and in the worst cases, murder, hurt others, we're obviously building up bad karma. Now, I do want to mention that in Buddhism, karma doesn't have the sense of like, you deserve it, like you got what was coming to you. Sometimes you hear people say that. They'll say like, oh, that person I don't like, they got in an accident, all karma. That's not really how karma works. Karma is sometimes defined as the moral law of cause and effect. So it's more of just a factual thing. It's just like, hey, if you do bad stuff, you put bad energy into the universe. And as we talked about earlier, because it's all a web of interconnected stuff, if you put something out in there, it's going to come back to you eventually. You put good stuff out into the universe, it goes out into the web, it'll come back to you eventually. And so it's the moral law of cause and effect. It's just cause and effect. You do bad stuff comes back. There's not that sense of deserving what you got in Buddhism in that sense. Now, as I mentioned before too, remember that your karma is following you all through successive lives. So after this life, unless you become enlightened in this life, you will have another life. And in that life, the karma you built up here will follow you there. Now, there seems to be a contradiction here, doesn't there? Because I just talked about how there isn't a self, and I just explained how there is no permanent self, and Buddhists believe that we're just sort of this interconnected stuff. So how then can there be karma, and how then can there be something that moves on from one existence to another if there's no self? Well, there's different Buddhists answer this in different ways, but the idea is that although there's no false self, there is still Buddha nature, and Buddha nature has some sort of more of a continuance or permanence to it than anything else in the universe. If anything, it's the one thing Buddhists believe is more real and more permanent than anything else. But the way it's often described is with a metaphor of a candle, and you can see the image there, the candle on the right. And it's kind of like Buddhists argue that when you start your life, it's like metaphorically you're a little candle flame. And as you live your life, and that's your Buddha nature that's there to be awakened, but as you live your life, that flame gets bigger, except the flame gets bigger because you're building it up with false stuff, with your false self. So in other words, your false self grows throughout your life, gets more robust, the flame increases. Then as you get towards death, you get kind of closer to Buddha nature again, but you may never reach it. And then that same flame, which has built up your karma from that life, it's retained in that flame, and in the next life, the same thing happens again. New life, the flame still has some parts of that previous life, it starts to get bigger, it builds up more karma now, which is all being tallied and calculated based on the previous karma. And that's what's called samsara. That's the cycle of life. You sort of shift through life and you go through all these different false selves. So your false self will be gone in the next life, but your karma will remain because your Buddha nature remains. So some people do see a little contradiction there. Buddhists try to resolve it. But remember, when we're talking about metaphysics, there's always going to be some things that are difficult to resolve in these areas. Now, the other part of reincarnation and karma is that, similar to Christianity, anybody can be saved, right? In Christianity, there's the idea that if you repent and you have true forgiveness in your heart, you can be saved. In Buddhism, it's similar. Basically, anybody can become enlightened, including somebody who has done the worst imaginable things. So there's a story from one of the other Buddhist texts, I'm forgetting which sutra it was, about this guy, Angulimala. And Angulimala, and by the way, I'm referring on that PowerPoint to the picture on the left side. And the Angulimala is the dude running towards the Buddha. The Buddha is the guy in the front with the, the halo thing around his head. And Angulimala means necklace of fingers. And you can see that he has a necklace of fingers around his neck. And those are the fingers of his victims. He was a vile, terrible murderer. And as the story goes, he supposedly met the Buddha, and the Buddha was so enlightened and aware at the time that Angulimala didn't know how to react. And supposedly he just sort of fell down and worshipped the Buddha, because everyone else had been afraid of him, and the Buddha was not afraid at all. The Buddha had compassion for him, and he had never experienced that before. So he fell down at the Buddha's feet and says, I repent. Now, here's the kicker, though, because karma, he had built up a lot of bad karma. He had, obviously he had killed people. So the first thing that happened was he was killed by the family members of his victims, right? And and presumably after he was killed, he would have reincarnated into a lower realm, and presumably into the realm of hell, as I'll talk about in a minute. But I just want to point out that idea that anybody can be saved, and theoretically, over time, Angulimala, after he went through these lower realms, he could reincarnate again and again. Now, it's going to take him a while, because he built up a lot of bad karma, but he could, in successive lifetimes, become like the Buddha, become enlightened, become compassionate over time. So there's never kind of a full loss of a being in Buddhism. There's always the capacity to turn yourself around in successive lifetimes. So how would that work? In this next image, you can see the 6 realms of rebirth. Now, depending on the Buddhists you talk to, some of them put them into 5. And basically, the realm of gods and demigods could be 1 or 2. But anyways, we'll just describe it as 6 in this case. And you can see the lower realms are literally the 3 realms on the bottom rung. And the one right in the middle is hell. And hell for a Buddhist is very similar to hell for a Christian or Muslim. It's a realm of torture. So Angulimala, because of his murderous past, would certainly have gone to hell. And he would have had to stay there for however long his karma took. So in Buddhism, we're sort of, as we build up karma, that karma has to be lived out. We have to eliminate that bad karma by paying for what we've done, so to speak. Again, it's not like a deserving kind of thing. It's just a cause and effect. You did this, you have to suffer these consequences. And so Angulimala would have had to stay in hell until his karma was fulfilled, and then he would have been reborn in a slightly higher realm. Now, people who do things like cheat and steal, but they don't, harm others to that degree, they would probably be reborn either into the animal realm. And the animal realm for Buddhists is just sort of a realm of pleasure, right? Animals don't think, according to Buddhists. They're just sort of mechanical. They just get the food and they, run around and so forth. And they reproduce. And there's one other lower realm called the realm of hungry ghosts, which I find interesting. It's sort of a realm of beings who have small mouths and huge stomachs, and they can never satisfy themselves. So this is for people who were like gluttons, who were hedonists, as we learned before, who just kind of fulfilled all their sensual pleasures and never thought about any higher truth. Now, here's the kicker, though. In the upper 3 realms, if you reincarnate into the upper 3 realms, you are still not enlightened, even if you're in the realm of what they call the gods or the demigods. So if you're in the realm of the gods, you're not mean to others necessarily. You certainly haven't murdered anyone. You're not cheating and stealing. You may even have realized the uselessness of material things. You're not attached to a lot of stuff. You've developed a lot. But what is still left in that realm is ego. there's still a little bit of ego, because you're still in competition with other gods and humans. So those gods still have this sense of, well, I'm more enlightened than he is, right? I'm more enlightened than that, which of course is not true enlightenment, because a true enlightened being wouldn't have any sense of desire for what someone else has, right? The ego would be completely removed. So in other words, if you reincarnate into these realms of gods and demigods, then you've advanced, but not fully. There's still some ego left within you. Now, Buddhists generally believe that the human realm, which is one of the top realms, is the only place from which you can become enlightened. So the idea in Buddhism is that we have this cycle of life that beings are constantly being reincarnated in, right? Their false self is building up, they're building up karma, their Buddha nature is always there, dormant, ready to be awakened, but most beings don't awaken it, and they just reincarnate from one to the next to the next. And when they do awaken, there's that option of, do I stay in the human realm and try to guide other beings towards enlightenment, which would be to be a bodhisattva, or do I just sort of bask in this heavenly realm of enlightenment? And by the way, it's sort of ambiguous in terms of what happens when you do become enlightened if you don't stay in the realm of humans to be a bodhisattva. It's, more like a heaven type existence, just sort of an appreciation, just sort of a reintegration with the universe, without kind of recycling yourself in the next existence. So that's pretty much how Buddhists see things. There's samsara, there's the cycle of life, and we're always suffering. There's always that dukkha beneath us, but it's because we have false attachments. We have false attachments to the self, and if we appreciated all these things, and we meditated and we changed, we could eventually find that Buddha nature within, and become awakened beings. So, to put it simply, Buddhism is a religion of awakening. Right? It's a religion of awakening what's inside us. Now, I want to mention one other misunderstanding before I end here, and that's about attachments. So, although it's true that Buddhists argue that attachments to material things can hinder us, it's important to emphasize attachment. Because in theory, it's not that a Buddhist can't own material things. Like if you see a Buddhist driving a nice car, that doesn't necessarily mean he's not enlightened just because he has a nice thing. It depends on his level of attachment to the car. So for instance, if that car suddenly gets stolen, a true Buddhist would just be very nonchalant about it and just say, oh, well, it was just a thing, it was fun while it was there. Just as though it was a baseball bat he was playing with at the park once that he left there and is gone now. So Buddhists can have material things, it's just they have to appreciate that they're material and that they're impermanent. Now, on the other hand, if a Buddhist was driving a car and then got really mad when somebody stole the car, they wouldn't be a true Buddhist, because then there would have been an attachment to that thing. Notice this also applies to relationships with other people. If you're attached to a person, a Buddhist would argue, you're not really in love with them, right? You're just attached. You feel like you can't live without them. That's not really love. True love would be some deeper connection on the level of Buddha nature, on the level of the true self, rather than just, I'm afraid of you leaving me type of thing. Right? So that would not be true love for a Buddhist. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up this lecture on Buddhism.